Welcome. For all of you who are Gettysburg fans, tonight's program should be a real treat. Author Tom McMillan is joining us to talk about 5 rebel soldiers who are from Gettysburg, who fought with the Confederate Army as it traveled around the South, and would return to their hometown for the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. Tom's experience comes as a sports journalist. He has been a newspaper sports writer. He's been a talk show host. He has covered the Olympics, the Stanley Cup Finals, the Super Bowl, the World Cup, NBA Finals, you name it. And he recently retired from a career as the Vice President of Communications for the Pittsburgh Penguins. He now puts his energy and his time into researching the Civil War. I hope you will enjoy this program tonight because Tom brings a whole new light to the story of brother fighting brother. So let me turn the program over to our host, Tom McMillan, for his book on Gettysburg Rebels.
Thank you. Gettysburg Rebels was certainly an interesting project. I had already written one book at that point. I'd written a book on Flight 93, the September 11th flight that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. It was just an opportunity that presented itself. But I'd always been such a student of the Civil War, and especially Gettysburg. I always kind of wanted to write a book on Gettysburg. I just wasn't sure there was still a fresh topic left. There have been so many books written. Because I wasn't one of those people who was going to write, the 10th book on the operations of the second day or the 50th book on Little Round Top. I wasn't sure there was anything out there fresh, and it turns out there was a topic that was staring me in my face all these years. If you go down the Emmitsburg Road to the intersection with the Wheatfield Road, you will see a sign, a mundane iron tablet that says simply Wentz House. Almost no one goes there. It's got to be the least visited place on the battlefield that has a sign. And that's because across the street is one of the most famous places on the battlefield, the Peach Orchard. And as you see behind, there's the Sherfy Barn, Sherfy Farm. So historic places all around. It doesn't look like anything's there. But this, if you look closely, you can see an irregular stone foundation. And this, in July 1863, was the home of John Wentz, his wife Mary, and one of his adult daughters. John had bought this property in 1836, coming over from York County. Back then, much larger family, many more young children, including a 9-year-old son named Henry. And Henry Wentz grew up on this piece of land and hunted and fished and knew the streams and the trails and the landscape. About 600 yards to the west, almost directly to the west, there is another mundane iron tablet, the kind the War Department put up early in the 20th century to mark troop positions. This is Taylor's Battery, Taylor's Virginia Battery. In this, on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, was the position of Confederate Artillery Sergeant Henry Wentz. Not only 600 yards from the house where he grew up, but where his parents still lived, and where, unbeknownst to him at the time, his father had decided to ride out the battle in the cellar. So it's a rather amazing story that hasn't been publicized much at all through the years. Now, I knew there was one other person from Gettysburg, a little more famous, who had also fought for the Confederate Army, and that would be Wesley Culp from the prolific Culp family of Gettysburg, the Culp Farm, Culp's Hill. 1860 Gettysburg census, there were 70 people named Culp in this small town. Wesley had gone south for work in the 1850s. He joined a militia unit that was absorbed into the Confederate Army, and 2 years later, he comes north and fights in the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, part of the legend that's been told over the years, I found that to be incorrect. The legend that's been told is that he was killed on July 3rd on Culp's Hill, which was a farm owned by his uncle, and that kind of tugs at the heartstrings. I found that he actually was killed on July 2nd on or near Wolf Hill, not Culp's Hill, and the farm was owned by a relative, but a much more distant relative than his uncle. So I have 2 of these guys who were Gettysburg Rebels, and I'm talking about book ideas. I was talking to my agent, my literary agent, and I had a couple of ideas, and he said, I think you ought to write the Gettysburg book, but is there enough for book length? And I said, I don't know. I have to start looking into this. So when you research Wesley Culp, you get into why did he go south? Well, he went south with his employer, a Gettysburg carriage maker named Charles William Hoffman, C.W. Hoffman. So I'm looking into him. In the 1850 Gettysburg census, and census reports really tell you a lot for those of you who've done research. 1850 Gettysburg census, C.W. Hoffman has 3 young sons who, if you add 10 or 11 years to their age, would be of age to be Confederate soldiers. So I went to the National Archives, and sure enough, Robert, Frank, and Wesley Hoffman, all born in Gettysburg, all raised on the second block of Chambersburg Street, were not only in the Confederate Army, but were part of the 75,000-man unit that Robert E. Lee brought north for the Great Invasion in the summer of 1863. Now I have 5 guys. Now, it's not just that they were Northerners, native Northerners fighting for the South. That happened throughout the war. Northerners fought for the South, Southerners fought for the North for all sorts of reasons. What made these guys different is they were coming back to their hometown. They were foreign invaders in their hometown. How many times has that happened in the history of the world? Probably not much. But because it was the Civil War, which means so much to our history, and the Battle of Gettysburg, the most famous battle, I thought it really deserved another look. So here is the roster of the guys I call the Gettysburg Rebels. Henry Wentz in the artillery. Wesley Culp and Robert Hoffman, they were both at 2nd Virginia Infantry Company B. Frank Hoffman's in the artillery, and Wesley Hoffman's in the cavalry. We hit all 3 branches of the service. Now, one of the most amazing things in doing this research found that there's no evidence that Robert E. Lee or any of his senior commanders had any idea they had 5 men from Gettysburg in their army. It was just an amazing lack of communication and coordination, because it was commonplace, particularly in the Confederate Army when they were fighting in Virginia. If there was a local man, they were near Richmond or Fredericksburg, it's a local man, they would pull him out of the ranks and briefly attach him to staff as a scout or guide. Made a lot of sense. James Longstreet did it. Stonewall Jackson did it. It's one of the reasons Jackson pulled off his flank march at Chancellorsville. No indication that happened here. And we know that at least on 2 occasions, the Confederate Army either got lost or confused by terrain. Now, these Gettysburg guys were not great soldiers. 4 of them never rose above the rank of private. 1 made it all the way to sergeant. But they would not have gotten lost. Whatever else they would have done in the battlefield, they would not have gotten lost. Consider the situations. Morning of July 2nd, 1863, Lee sends his topographical engineer, Samuel Johnston, out to reconnoiter the Union left. Johnston comes back a few hours later and says he has reached the top of the hill that we now call Little Round Top, and there were no Union troops in the vicinity. We know later that he could not have reached Little Round Top because while there weren't troops on it, there were troops near it. He would have seen them, certainly would have heard them, and they would have seen or heard him. So Lee basically based his second day's attack plan on flawed and faulty intelligence. Now, later that afternoon, as James Longstreet is looking to execute this plan, he's told to conceal his troops from Union signalmen on Little Round Top. They come over a bald rise just beyond the Black Horse Tavern. They can see the signalmen, which means the signalmen can see them. Lots of invectives are hurled. They do a counter march, and it costs them, as we know, several miles and several hours. The attack started much later than it was supposed to be that afternoon. There was, however, 1 Confederate unit that did make it into position on time that day, and it was an artillery unit with big guns and horses under the command of E.P. Alexander. He said, we zigzagged through the fields, found an old farm lane, and pulled into position and waited several hours for the infantry. Is it just a coincidence that the only Confederate Union in Longstreet's attack that day that got into position on time had in its ranks a man from Gettysburg named Henry Wentz? Now, Wentz wrote nothing about his Civil War experiences, or if he did, nothing exists. E.P. Alexander wrote a lot. He never mentioned Wentz in this report, and Alexander was a trained engineer. He could have done this on his own. He's a West Point guy. I just find it hard to believe that the only Confederate unit that got into position on time had Henry Wentz in it. So I always believe that Henry had something to do with that. So to the story, when I was talking about this, Wayne Motts, the legendary Gettysburg guide and current president of the Gettysburg Foundation, told me, Tom, especially with guys who aren't well known, you really need their photos. You need their photos to tell the story. So here's the photo of Wesley Culp. You've probably seen that, taken in 1861 or 1862, sometime before the battle here. Here are the photos of the other guys. That is not a 65-year-old man having trouble with his PowerPoint. They don't exist. I tried hard. I tracked down at least 9 descendants. Nobody had any photos. So with due respect to Wayne, and I told him this, I wish I could have had the photos. It wasn't going to prevent me from writing the story. I really hoped that once the book came out that somebody somewhere would go into an attic or a basement, see a photo, and say, now I know who that is, but never happened. So I think these photos don't exist. Remember, most of the books we read are written about generals or battlefield heroes. These were just regular guys. So photos weren't always kept. So back to Wesley Culp. Start the story with him. He is born in July of 1839 in Adams County, but not in Gettysburg. But his family clearly had deep Gettysburg roots. They'd been there since the Revolution. He was part of the 4th generation. His father, Esaias Culp, born and raised here, started his family in Gettysburg, started his tailoring business in Gettysburg. But for whatever reason, in the 1830s, he moved 14 miles away to a little place then called Petersburg, now York Springs, and that's where Wesley was born in 1839. He lives the first 8 years of his life up there, 14 miles from Gettysburg. We know, though, now that the family is back in Gettysburg in 1847. How do we know that? Newspaper ads. Check out this ad. Esaias J. Culp has a new tailoring establishment. If you're doing research, this time period, you can really follow people, business people, through the newspapers. If you wanted to publicize your business, you couldn't buy a television ad. You couldn't put it on social media. So here it is, Esaias Culp with the ad in 1847. So Wesley lives here from 1847 to 1856. From the time he's about 8 to the time he's about 17. Very formative years. Why does he leave? He leaves with his employer, the carriage maker C.W. Hoffman. So I really have to look into him. I really thought he would be a transitional person in this story. He's a really key piece, because what I did not know is he was one of the most influential citizens of Gettysburg in the 1840s and 1850s. He's pretty much been written out of borough history because he went south and became a Confederate sympathizer. Consider this. He owned multiple businesses. He owned at least 10 pieces of property. He was elected 3 times to Gettysburg Borough Council. He was trustee of the Methodist Episcopal Church. He was on the local Temperance Committee, meaning he was one of the local teetotalers. He would not like it that the Gary Owen Irish Tavern is right near his property now. And in the 1850s, 1855, he was also part of a group of esteemed citizens who founded and created a new cemetery in that town. Then 2 words, Evergreen Cemetery, which of course made the battlefield landmark we know as Cemetery Hill, and also is where Abraham Lincoln came to deliver the Gettysburg Address. So why did this guy leave? He's really established in town. 1855, he opens another new business. He runs for a 3-year term on Gettysburg Council. It seems like the guy's putting on deeper roots. Why does he leave within a year? I talked to some people, they thought, well, the carriage business, the market was really down in Virginia. Maybe he was just going to where the market was. And I probably would have written that, except that one day I was at the Adams County Historical Society, and I was looking through Methodist church records. In the process, a sidebar here, I discovered a cure for insomnia. Have you ever had trouble sleeping? Just try to read through Methodist church records from the 1850s. They'll put you right to sleep. But I did not awake at one point. I found a very key point. Check this out. On Monday, the 26th day of June last, said C.W. Hoffman imprudently and unnecessarily engaged with one John Barrett in a cruel fight by striking with a stick or club, throwing stones, and striking with iron. You can read a little more of this, but obviously there was a big fight, and at the end it showed highly improper conduct and sinful tempers and actions on the part of said C.W. Hoffman, and shamefully outraged the cause of God. The sitting borough councilman and church trustee beat the crap out of somebody. He was arrested, charged, fined, and humiliated. And I think this is the process that starts it. He starts to sell his property in 1855, and in March of 1856, we know he is heading south to Shepherdstown, now West Virginia, then Virginia, and he takes 4 future Confederate soldiers with him, his 3 sons and Wesley Culp. And one of the first things the older boys do, Robert Hoffman and Wesley Culp, both about 16 or 17 years old, one of the first things they do when they get to Shepherdstown, they join militia unit. This is commonplace at the time. You got to carry a gun, wear a uniform, march around, pretend like you're in the army. Great social outlet, especially for newcomers to town, and also good show. We're going to protect Shepherdstown. We're going to protect our new town. This is, again, very commonplace and led to a lot of units that went into the Civil War. Now, the same thing happened about 10 miles away in another little town called Martinsburg, now West Virginia, then Virginia. Henry Wentz, he was older than these guys. He went a few years earlier, but he did the same thing. He joined the Martinsburg Independent Blues militia unit. These guys, it did lead them eventually to the Confederate Army, but for these guys in particular, it was their first chance of actually getting experience in some combat. 1859, another nearby town, nearby to Shepherdstown and Martinsburg, in Harper's Ferry, the John Brown raid. John Brown, wide-eyed abolitionist, with his small army, steals into town. He seizes the arsenal and armory, takes some prisoners, frees a few slaves. He wants to begin a big slave insurrection. Obviously causes huge panic. The people of Harper's Ferry send out for help from local militia units. And who comes in? Militia units from Shepherdstown and Martinsburg. We have primary evidence that Henry Wentz and Robert Hoffman were there, and secondary evidence that Wesley Culp was there. So these guys were part of this. We also know through history that President James Buchanan, he's worked up about this. He sends about 90 Marines up from D.C. They're under the command of a U.S. Army colonel who'd been back in the area visiting family. So these guys come forward under the command of U.S. Army Colonel Robert E. Lee, and they quickly put down the raid and capture Brown. So this is the first time that Henry Wentz, Robert Hoffman, Wesley Culp serve under Robert E. Lee, but it wouldn't be the last. I think one thing that struck me here as I'm looking, that these guys happen to live in a part of the country where the Civil War was boiling 2 years before it broke out. It had to affect their thought process and what they were thinking. We looked through the records, and there was no 24/7 news. They weren't thinking about it all the time. I was able, following some research that was started by the great Bill Frazanito, a great friend of the Historical Society, I was able to track down a Culp descendant and get some letters that Wesley wrote home from Shepherdstown and Martinsburg in 1860. Look here. Here is his. I published it for the first time. The full letter's in the book. There's his signature, J. Wesley Culp. His name was John Wesley Culp. It's really a mundane letter he's writing to his sister. Kind of think people write to each other. How's our father? Here's $1 for a new bonnet. But he does say the next year, within a year, he plans to go west and seek his fortune. This is the summer of 1860. Of course, we know April of 1861, something happens that changes the future for Wesley and hundreds of thousands of other young men in the country. Confederates fire on Fort Sumter. Civil War breaks out. 3 of these guys are ready almost immediately. Within 2 weeks, Henry Wentz, Robert Hoffman, Wesley Culp are all enlisted in the Confederate Army. Robert and Wesley report to Harper's Ferry. Their militia unit becomes Company B of the 2nd Virginia Infantry. They're assigned to the 1st Virginia Brigade, and their first commander is a man just arrived from VMI named Thomas Jonathan Jackson. He had not yet earned the nickname Stonewall, but this was the very beginning of the famed Stonewall Brigade, and Robert Hoffman and Wesley Culp would serve under Stonewall Jackson until his death at Chancellorsville in 1863. Now, the same thing was happening in the North, in Gettysburg. On April 20th, the same day that Wesley Culp enlisted in the Confederate Army, his brother William enlists in the Union Army. They formed a three-month regiment. The 2nd Pennsylvania was William and a number of Wesley's cousins and his good boyhood friend Jack Skelly, and they march off towards the 2nd Pennsylvania. Now, these 2 units almost met very early in the war, before First Manassas. Little skirmish down by Falling Waters. The Union troops got the better of it. Wesley Culp was involved in the fighting. Jackson pulled his men back. The 2nd Pennsylvania got there late. They came in after the Confederates had retreated, But Jack Skelly wrote a letter back to his mother back in Gettysburg with the bravado of someone who'd never been in battle. They wouldn't stand and fight. We would have given them what they deserved. But he did say Wes Culp was with them. He was seen by the people of Martinsburg as they went through. So this is the first time that people in Gettysburg, maybe even his sisters, but certainly everybody else knew that Wesley Culp was fighting for the Confederate Army, and they weren't very happy about it. Now, I follow these guys. They don't leave a lot of primary source records. I follow them a lot through their units, their unit actions. They were some of the most famous battles, but you pick out a few things from their Army records. Robert Hoffman went AWOL 4 times in the first year and a half of the war. 4 times. Every time he's allowed back in the Confederate Army with almost no punishment. It's very curious to me. So I looked into it. Well, it turns out for the old man, C.W. Hoffman, the carriage thing in Shepherdstown didn't work very well. He's only there a few years. 1859, he pulls up stakes, moves closer to D.C. He buys a 500-acre farm in Fauquier County, Virginia, and becomes, after being a carriage maker, a farm owner. It's where he becomes a slaveholder. Slaves were part of the property listed in his deeds. He goes to work. He's a businessman at heart. He goes to work right away supplying the Confederate Army. Multiple receipts of grain, horses, cattle, blacksmithing services. So I think that Robert Hoffman certainly was coming home to check on the safety of his parents. They were really between the lines of the two armies. But also probably to help his father with some of this supply duty. I think that's why, maybe an explanation why he was allowed back into the Army so many times without punishment. Now, Wesley Culp, Wesley's one of those guys, things just happen. Wesley's got a little bit of trouble, just different than other people. Spring of 1862, spring and early summer, he's taken prisoner not once, but twice by the Union Army. Taken prisoner, released, taken prisoner again. The first time is at Kernstown after the Battle of Winchester. He's taken prisoner, released fairly quickly, but we've learned about it because of a letter that Jack Skelly's mother, Elizabeth Skelly, wrote to him. Now think of this situation. The Skellys lived on West Middle Street at what is now 47 West Middle Street. That's not a historic building, but that's the site. Right across the street was Wesley Culp's sister, Ann Culp Myers. She and Elizabeth Skelly were friends. So the mother of a Union soldier was friends with the sister of a Confederate soldier. They're talking about the war. How surreal is this when you think about it? This is a letter that she writes. Did you know Wes Culp was taken prisoner at Winchester but was released on parole? He wrote to Anne, God only knew what he suffered while he was a prisoner. Do you all pity him? Anne tries to excite sympathy. Do you all pity him? Clearly, these ladies didn't understand quite what was going on, but this is the word we receive. Now, Wesley is taken prisoner again in early June. He's taken to prison in Baltimore, probably Fort McHenry. It just so happens that the Gettysburg boys, they have re-enlisted in a 3-year unit, the 87th Pennsylvania. So William Culp and the 87th are near Baltimore. William somehow gets word of this. He gets a pass to visit Wesley in prison. The Union brother visits the Confederate brother in prison. He writes about it to Anne back in Gettysburg. She's like Grand Central Station. She's getting all these letters. He writes, I got a permit from the Provost Marshal yesterday to visit Wesley. I was with him about 2 hours and a half. He told me to tell you not to be uneasy about him because he is well and will soon get out. I will try to see him as often as I can, but it is hard to get a permit to see anyone in the jail. Now, at about this same time, late May, early June, another person gets taken prisoner. The old man, C.W. Hoffman. He's not in the Army, but he's giving them supplies, and the Union Army's had just about enough of him. The troops under John Gary go to the farm. They seize him, take him prisoner. This is reported, these two, the Culp and Hoffman arrests are reported in the same day in a Gettysburg paper, one paragraph above the other. This is the actual newspaper account. You can see C.W. Hoffman and Wesley Culp. I have a clearer account here. What that account said was, we learned that C.W. Hoffman, formerly of this place, has been in the rebel army for some time with his three sons. He obviously was just supplying them. He was captured a few days ago near Linden, Virginia by General Geary's command and is now in prison in Washington. How much better to have joined his fortunes with the Union men than send down his name to his posterity as a traitor. Now, right below that is this paragraph. Our young townsman Wesley Culp was taken prisoner at the Battle of Winchester, took the oath of allegiance, was released, then joined a band of guerrillas and has been captured again. He is good and ripe for summary process, or at least ought to be. Folks, partisan journalism did not begin in the 21st century. It was alive and well here in Gettysburg in the 1860s. They weren't very happy about this. These guys are not in prison long. C.W. Hoffman, only a few weeks. We know this because he's back in business in July already. There are more receipts. He didn't care. He was still supplying Confederate troops. And Wesley is released in a massive prisoner exchange in early of August of 1862. So we fast forward now to June of 1863. Robert E. Lee is marshaling his 75,000-man army to come north. This is the first time that all 5 Gettysburg rebels are together. Frank Hoffman with the artillery, Wesley Hoffman with the cavalry have joined the big group, and they are coming north. Now, they don't know they're coming to Gettysburg. They know they're just coming north. Along the way, a portion of the army is tasked with cleaning out a Union garrison in Winchester. Wesley Culp and the 2nd Virginia are part of that group, and this is where we have, in mid-June 1863, we hear brother versus brother. This really was brother versus brother. The 2nd Virginia against 87th Pennsylvania. Wesley Culp against William Culp. The Confederate troops get the best of this fighting. They capture 6 battle flags, including the 87th PA. They take 200 prisoners from the 87th alone, one of whom is not William Culp. He somehow slips away and walks with several of his comrades back to Gettysburg. A couple of the Gettysburg ladies talk about this in their diaries. The rest of the prisoners, however, are paraded through Winchester, and Wesley Culp sees a familiar face. He sees his old friend and second cousin, actually, Billy Holdsworth, and he says, "Hey, Billy, prisoner, are you? Anything I can do for you?" And Holdsworth said, "No, Wes, I'm fine. But Jack Skelly's wounded. He's back on the edge of the woods. Can you help him?" So Wesley Culp, hearing of this, he rushes to the end of the woods. It's easy to find Jack Skelly. He talks to him. He takes him to some doctors so he can get some medical care. They have a conversation. This is a famed conversation we hear later because Jack gives Wesley a message. Now, the legend is that it was for his fiancée, Jenny Wade. I can tell you that it was, as it was first reported, and certainly is in Culp family private documents, the message was actually for Mrs. Skelly, not Jenny Wade. Doesn't really matter, but it was a message for Mrs. Skelly, apparently not written, apparently verbal. If Wesley gets back, he's supposed to pass this on. Now, to check on Robert Hoffman's case during this time in June of 1863, we know that he's not a very good soldier. He's gone AWOL 4 times already. By this point, you look at his service records, and he is assigned to drive cattle. You kind of get a smirk in your face with that, but you think of it, very important part of why Lee came north to get supplies. They're going to steal cattle. The army needs beef. An army needs beef to move. Guys have to eat. They send at least half the cattle back to the supply lines now at Winchester, and half goes with the army. So how do we know Robert is with the army? This receipt in late June, signed near Carlisle, Pennsylvania. 25 head of beef cattle. Robert Hoffman, you see at the bottom here, there's his signature for the use of Edward Johnson and the Stonewall Brigade. So Robert Hoffman is coming forward. Now, he's not an infantry unit. He really would have been a key guy who could have been a scout or a guide. They wouldn't have had to pull him off the front lines. He was behind the lines, but he was here. Nonetheless, they didn't take advantage of that. Now, none of these guys are there for the start of the fighting on July 1st. The first one to arrive is naturally Wesley Culp. His unit gets there on the evening of July 1st. At dusk, they come in on Carlisle Street. They pass what will soon be the Majestic Theater. They make a left at the square and head up toward the Hanover Road. How do we know that? There's something in the regimental history, but we also have an account from a man from Shepherdstown who was on brigade staff but used to be in the militia unit, Benjamin Pendleton. He does an interview with a Pittsburgh reporter on the 50th anniversary of the battle, and this is what he says. "We came in on the Carlisle Road, and the head of the column turned left at the square. There were few citizens of the town to be seen, for there had been much fighting in the streets before we arrived. The townspeople made themselves scarce, so that no one welcomed or recognized Wes Culp on his homecoming." These guys, again, they'll go north to the Hanover Road. They make camp. Most of the soldiers bed down. Not Wesley Culp. He gets a pass to go into town. So his brigade commander, James Walker, knows he's from Gettysburg. Offers him a chance, said, "Wes, if you don't feel right, if you don't think you can be in this fighting, you can sit this one out. Wes said, no, I'm in the Army. I'll do it. I just want to pass. He goes into town to visit his sister, Anne, on West Middle Street. Imagine this scene. It's dark. It's at night. It's the Confederates hold the town, but it's a Union town. People have shotguns. It had to be terrifying. And imagine the sisters. The war has come to their town, noise and blood and wounded and killing. And now there's a knock at their door in the dark, and there's a man in a Confederate uniform. They open the door. It's their brother. They haven't seen him for 2 years. Hugging and kissing, blood thicker than water. They share stories. One of the younger sisters yells at him a little bit for shooting at William. William must have told the story of Winchester when he was briefly at home, and West said, I didn't know it was in the dark. He says he has a message from Mrs. Skelly. He'll be back one of the next few days to give it to her. And then he has to go. The sisters really want him to stay. He obviously has to rejoin his unit, and they say, Wes, we're afraid we won't ever see you again. 2 nights later, July 3rd, after Pickett's charge, after the battle proper is over, another Confederate soldier comes to the Culp sisters' door. It's Benjamin Pendleton, the man from Shepherdstown, who knows the Culp sisters from their many visits to Shepherdstown before the war to see Wesley. He has the sad news that their brother has been killed. He tells them, and this is in Culp family documents, that Wesley was killed on the skirmish line on the morning of July 2nd, shot in the head. He said they buried him where they found him, and he describes a tree, a bent tree where they could find the body. The problem was, he tells them it was Culp's Hill. They were not on Culp's Hill at this time, but the Confederates did not know the topography, the geography. They often misidentified sites. So when the Culp sisters go out, they go to the wrong place. Because in research here, I have to find, it's a great story, but was there evidence? Was the 2nd Virginia actually skirmishing on the morning of July 2nd? The legend, he was killed on July 3rd. Yes, they were. His unit was sent out to skirmish early on the morning of July 2nd near Wolf Hill. The regimental and brigade commanders write about it in their reports. The 9th Massachusetts and 27th Indiana write about skirmishing with the 2nd Virginia. It's up. There's a place called the old Deerdorf place. It's still there on Montclair Road. This is about where this skirmishing went, near 15. So I think that's where Wesley Culp met his demise, near Wolf Hill, not Culp's Hill. So the Culp sisters are going out a few days later, and they're looking for this tree. They can't find it. They never find his body, but they do find his gun. Mark W. Culp, broken off. Okay, smart guy, how'd they find his gun and not his body? Well, my theory on this, and I've run it past people like Charlie Fennell and Dean Schultz, is that with the Confederates' lack of equipment, Wesley was the only man in his unit killed during the battle. They weren't going to let a functioning musket lay there on the ground. Somebody picked it up and carried it through the rest of the battle. And they were near Culp's Hill, at the base of Culp's Hill, on July 3rd. So I think that's how it got here, how the sisters found the gun stock, but not the body. The Culp family has always discounted rumors that he was secretly buried in Evergreen Cemetery. They, worried that it might have been desecrated generations later. There's no reason to cover that up. There is a ceremonial tombstone for him down at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, but there's no record that he was buried there. Some people thought it was in Shepherdstown because he lived there. There's a big Confederate portion of one of the cemeteries, but they're mostly from the Battle of Antietam. He probably was, remained where he was buried, maybe under Route 15. I will tell you, though, that my wife and I are such Gettysburg geeks. We actually have a cemetery plot in Evergreen Cemetery. We're in the historic section. We're only 2 rows in front of the Culps. They opened some area that used to be fenced. So I always think, wouldn't it be amazing when, hopefully in 20 or 30 years, when they're putting me in the ground, they dig down and they find Wesley Culp. If that's the case, I hope somebody puts it retroactively in my obituary. But we basically, we simply don't know. So that's Wesley's story. We go to Henry Wentz, his amazing story on the afternoon of July 2nd. He's part of the artillery attack. They're going after Sickles salient at the Peach Orchard salient. It's also the Wentz Farm salient. E.P. Alexander, after a while, they're doing pretty well. He limbers up his artillery. They charge forward. Henry Wentz is not only charging toward his boyhood home, and the home where his parents live, he's actually charging over land that he personally owns. The deed records at the Historical Society Frazanito first found them, led me to them, that in the late 1840s, Mr. Wentz bought 9-acre property there and turned it over to his son Henry. So Henry owned the land on this land. It's a 9-acre. It's on the southwest corner of that intersection with the Emmitsburg Road and the Wheatfield Road. So I can't imagine. Wish he'd written about this, what it was like going over his own land. Ends up about 150 yards north of the Wentz farm. That evening when the fighting dies down, he does go into the house and visit his father. We have this from an early Gettysburg historian, W.C. Storick. He was a young boy alive at the time of the battle, one of the early battlefield guys. But he also had family ties. There was a marriage tie to the Wentz family, so he had access to Wentz family oral history. And this is what Storick writes. On the night of the second day after Sickles' advance line at the Wentz house had been repulsed and occupied by the forces under General Lee, Henry Wentz visited his old home and was greatly surprised to find his father still there. I wish he'd written more. That's all we have, but we know. So now we have two of these guys, Wesley Culp and Henry Wentz, visiting immediate family members during the battle as foreign invaders. Next day, morning of July 3rd, Henry Wentz and Frank Hoffman are both involved in the Great Cannonade. Henry is posted near the Klingel House. Frank is posted near the Rogers Place. You know, there's one curious aspect of the artillery barrage, and that was that you probably know this story, a tombstone in Evergreen Cemetery was hit. Probably wasn't from these guys, probably wasn't from A.P. Hill's gunners, but this is it. That, of course, known to people in Gettysburg, is the tombstone of Wesley Culp's father, Esaias Culp. Of all things, of all coincidence, his is the tombstone that is hit by artillery fire, and it's marked there. It's one of the great landmarks of the battlefield. Now, Pickett's charge happens. Obviously, the Confederates attack and are repulsed. I always give what I think is the shortest account of Pickett's charge. After the battle proper, Wesley Hoffman and the cavalry involved in the Battle of Fairfield. Henry Wentz is one of the last guys to leave the battlefield. E.P. Alexander and the brigade commander Taylor write that they were one of the last units to leave very late at night, so they pull back. It's said again from Storick that he went in to see his father. His father was sleeping. Who knows if that was true, but he was certainly near his house. So that's their deal at the Battle of Gettysburg. The 4 survivors all served the remainder of the war. 2 of them were wounded. 4 are taken prisoner. Henry Wentz taken prisoner just days before Appomattox. Eventually, they all sign oaths of allegiance to get back in the country. This is Robert Hoffman's oath of allegiance. So look where he signs at Harper's Ferry. Think of this. 1859, this man goes to Harper's Ferry to put down the John Brown raid. 1861, he goes to Harper's Ferry to enlist in the Confederate Army. In 1865, he's back at Harper's Ferry to sign his oath of allegiance and regain his citizenship to the United States. The first one to die is Henry Wentz. He dies in the 1870s. I'm often asked, are there stories not known because they covered this up? They were ashamed of it. They covered up the fact that they were in the Confederate Army. Absolutely not. Henry's obituary in the Martinsburg paper identifies him as a proud Confederate soldier and even says that his father owned land on the Gettysburg battlefield. Now, the last to die was Frank Hoffman. He lives all the way till 1920. He's living in D.C. at the time with adult daughters. And there's a very extensive obituary in the Washington Times. The daughters probably provided the information. The headline was Pennsylvania Man Who Fought for the Confederacy. And it said he came from a prominent family in south central Pennsylvania. So their stories were known at the time. They just somehow got lost over time. Now, one of those daughters lived until 1972. Folks, someone was alive only 50 years ago who knew one of these guys. It's not all that long ago. How I wish she had written something, but she didn't, so this is all we have. So that's the story of the men I call the Gettysburg Rebels. They were on the losing side of the battle and the losing side of the war. They certainly were on the wrong side of history, fighting for a government and an army that was going to continue the institution of slavery. But they were also witnesses to and participants in one of the great cataclysmic events of American history. And on top of that, they were foreign invaders in their old hometown. And I just thought that was a story that deserved to be told. So thank you.
Tom, I was fascinated by your story, and you certainly are an excellent storyteller. You have a passion for the subject. But my question is, where did you get the research? I cannot imagine how you found these original documents. Where do you go to look for something like that?
A little bit of everywhere, and fortunately, my wife Colleen is a good researcher too, and she loved it. So we did this as a couple, but it was an amazing journey. These things weren't easy to find. That was part of the fun and the passion of this project. Certainly, small town courthouses, newspaper files, obviously the National Archives and Library of Congress come up with some things, but we found a lot of things at the Adams County Historical Society. It really was became near and dear to our hearts. There's so much in a place like that really helped us. The people have done such work over the years, and residences and little tidbits here and there. We found some things about the Hoffman family. I did find a Hoffman family history in a library down in Dallas. We traveled down to pick that up. It was really helpful. But, with the Adams County Historical Society, there was so much there, and I really have to give a lot of credit to my friend Bill Frazanito, who's a legend in these parts and should be. He really created a lot of the paths that I was able to follow in his book, Early Photography, which is a monster, about 500 pages. He did have something about some Wesley Culp and William Culp descendants. And through those names that he had, I was able to find them and track them down. And that's where I got the 1860 letters written by Wesley Culp and some of the family documents and William Culp's visit to Fort McHenry to visit Wesley. There was a man in near Harrisburg whose last name was Fonstock, from the Fonstock brothers of Gettysburg. So a Fonstock married a Culp, which is really fascinating to me. Mike Fonstock, he was great. His father was really the historian in the family. He told me I could look at any of his father's stuff. I thought he would let me come to his house with white gloves. And he texted me the next day and said, Tom, I put those letters to you in the mail. So he mailed the 1860 letters to me. Thankfully, they arrived. And I can tell you, when you hold something that's written from 1860 in your history level, your hands really shake. And that really added so much to this story. Any little piece of that. This was a kind of a tough book to put together because these guys weren't generals. They didn't leave lots of Army records. It was really a research journey. The research was much more part of this project than the writing. So all of those little places, the historical societies and the county courthouses and the newspapers, and again with Frazanito kind of, I don't say leading the way, but pointing the way. And I talked to Bill afterwards, and I didn't know him before this, and I talked to him. I didn't know if he would be taken aback by it because it was kind of his project at the beginning. He said, no, this is what you want as a historian. You hope your work will lead other people down roads, and they can build on that. So I think we all hope for that. But the Historical Society has become a really important place to me, and I really can't wait till the new building opens. Andrew and the staff are doing a great job.
Fabulous. Did you find any diaries, first-person accounts, nothing like that?
No, and again, I think either a lot of people, there's so many people who fought in the war, a lot of them didn't write, or if they did, their families didn't save the documents. I think if your descendant was famous, you may have saved all the documents. Some of this stuff just got lost. I'm sure these guys wrote letters, but nothing from Henry Wentz, nothing written in the Hoffman's hands. During the war. I did find that Hoffman family history where there was a narrative written by Robert Hoffman's daughter where she wrote about her father's experiences and some of the things that he said and her mother said and her uncle said. But they aren't exactly primary sources, but it's as close as we can get. And I talked to the person who compiled the Hoffman family history, who compiled this report, and there just weren't any. I think it strikes you that, there's a lot of information from a relatively small group of people when you consider the number of the vast volume of soldiers who fought in the Civil War. We don't have a lot of those records, and that was one of the challenges. There weren't as many primary sources as I would like to have had. But do you write the book? And the answer was yes, because this is all I'm convinced this is all anybody could find on these guys. I don't think there is anything more. And I thought there was enough to put together the story, so that was part of the project. But the Robert Hoffman's daughter and the National Archives, the military records, the pension records, the newspaper records, and some of the other things I was able to, and the items in the Historical Society, census records, it was enough to piece, this was really more than any of my other books was putting a puzzle together. It was the hardest research journey, in some ways the most rewarding because of that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fascinating story.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.